ITV now, a survival special captures animals on canvas in a brush with nature. Here on 4 Dispatches asks if the newly privatised electricity market is being rigged.
On Dispatches tonight, the crisis in Britain's coalfields that won't go away. As the deadline draws nearer on 31 pit closures and 30,000 miners' jobs, Dispatches traces the real sequence of events which laid coal low. And as 2 separate reviews examine the evidence, Dispatches conducts its own review, revealing the true market forces behind today's new privatised electricity industry. Has the government now any way out? Or does a rigged market prevent any long-term future for British coal? All the leading players make their pitch tonight in this, the Generation Game.
Didcot, one of the largest coal-fired power stations in Britain. It consumes 3 million tonnes of British deep. Built 20 years ago and with another 20 years of life left in it. But it may not last that long. It could be the victim of a market distorted by subsidies, dominated by monopolies and protected from competition. A market created in the name of private enterprise. That same market which threatens the future of the British coal industry.
Well, we have to deal with the market as it is. If I had the power to change the market, I would change the market.
At the present time, we've got an energy market which is deliberately rigged against the coal industry.
There is, I think, a myth about that what's happening now is a result of so-called market forces. I don't subscribe to that view at all.
The time limited the competition we could create.
The current problems of the coal industry are the direct result of one of the government's privatisations. The privatisation of electricity in England and Wales, launched with a multi-million-pound advertising campaign, was first announced in the Conservative Manifesto of 1987.
Morning, Frank. Sleep well.
Said to the world, dear.
With the lavish use of humour, the campaign announced the arrival of a new era of competitive market forces. In future, the consumer was to be in charge.
Privatisation was all about removing the influence of politicians from the electricity generating industry. As a result of their influence, the electricity industry had been saddled with wrong technology, been forced to build power stations that it didn't need, where it didn't want to put them, and had been constantly manipulated by politicians for their own ends, either with employment in view or producing the right prices at the right time.
But substantial manipulation was required to achieve the goal of privatisation. Each compromise, as the government aimed at its privatisation target, was bad for British coal. The electricity industry, before privatisation in 1990, was a monolith. British Coal supplied just one company, the Central Electricity Generating Board, which made the electricity and supplied it to the 12 area boards, who sold it to the domestic and commercial customers. The privatised structure does not look very different. There are still area boards, But now, these are regional electricity companies. Instead of buying from the Central Electricity Generating Board, they now have a choice of just two companies, National Power and Power Gen. This lack of competition was the result of the government's determination to push the £10 billion privatisation programme through in the life of one parliament.
The difficulty was that in the time available, and we had to develop a plan, create a structure, and get those companies to the market all in 4 years, which is quite a difficult thing to do. For various technical reasons, it simply wasn't possible to create a more diverse structure than the one we eventually came up with.
I just don't think that makes sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense to do something quickly and to do the wrong thing. I mean, it can't. I mean, all the trouble we're in now would not have happened if the government had taken more time and given more thought to electricity privatisation.
The trouble the government finds itself in is defending the closure of pits like Markham Main and 30 others. All around the country, miners were given just a few days' notice of some of the biggest cutbacks in British coal's history.
This would be an unprecedented pace of closure condensed into a very, very short period of time, but against a demand that was painfully and brutally clear. And the position had been apparent for many months. It had been communicated to everybody concerned for many months. But the position as to the coal that the generators would take was absolutely clear.
Hatfield Colliery in South Yorkshire is another earmarked for closure. There are many reasons why demand for British coal has dropped. Most of them are a direct result of the way in which the government constantly chopped and changed its plans for the future shape of the privatised electricity industry. When the government first set out on its route to privatisation, the first thing that set it off course was the nuclear industry. That was the first blow against coal. Sizewell B on the Suffolk coast, currently being built at a cost of over £2 billion, is one of the nuclear industry's 14 power stations. All the nuclear stations used to be owned by the Central Electricity Generating Board. Originally, the government hoped it could sell these along with the coal-fired stations. But it had to pull them back from the package when it realised that investors were frightened off by the massive cost of closing down the old stations. Faced with this, the government had a choice. It could have closed down the nuclear industry, abandoned the building of Sizewell B, and let the taxpayers foot the bill. Instead, it decided as a separate company and make the consumer pay. The government wanted nuclear as an insurance policy against British coal being unable to provide a secure supply of fuel.
We decided we needed nuclear so that we would have secure supplies. And having decided we needed it, it had to be paid for. So we put the obligation on the area boards to buy a proportion of nuclear electricity. We invented a way called the non-fossil fuel levy. The non-fossil fuel obligation put on them the duty to buy. The levy was a way of making sure that all users paid.
A lot of people think it's a subsidy for nuclear electric. Well, in fact, it's not. When nuclear electric was formed just over 2 years ago, it inherited all the liabilities for the decommissioning of the power stations it was given. In other words, it inherited the liabilities for the previous 30 years' operation. But it was given no cash to cover those decommissioning liabilities.
Well, nuclear's always been heavily subsidised in this country. And now we have the nuclear levy, which makes this more explicit. And it's quite clear nuclear is being treated differently from other fuels, and it's got a special place in the market. It's providing around 20% of the electricity generated in Great Britain. And I mean, this is a huge distortion of the marketplace.
When we were first formed, we took about 16% market share. Today, we're about 20%. In other words, we've increased our market share, and we've done that because we're competitive.
Although it has increased its share, nuclear electric is only in business because it's a slice of the market. And it can only sell this electricity because it receives a subsidy of £1.3 billion, paid for by consumers on their electricity bills. Without this subsidy, it would not be competitive against cheap coal-fired stations. This was the first blow against coal. The second blow against coal was the fate of the CEGB. This was split into two, National Power and Power Gen. Both of these went into the private sector. British Coal was left in the public sector. This radically altered the balance of power between the companies. Coal arrives at Drax in Yorkshire, the largest coal-fired power station in Europe. It takes 10 million tonnes of British coal every year and lights a tenth of Britain's houses. Once owned by the CEGB, it is now owned by National Power, the larger of the two electricity generating companies. These two companies, which now consume most of British Coal's output, are in the private sector, free to shop around. British Coal remains in the public sector and is not free to broaden its business.
Relative to my two large and valued customers, I am in a position of profound market weakness. They have many sources of fuel available to them. I have two customers who take 80% of my production.
Electricity has to be used when it's made. And if my power stations have got costs which are out of line with somebody else's, my power stations get marginalised, they will not run, this company earns no revenue, and the shareholders and the customers will be rightly upset.
Now in the private sector, Baker has to satisfy his shareholders by increasing profits. He has to keep National Power's turbines running, hang on to his enormous share of the market, and reduce costs. It was obvious at the time of privatisation that many of the electricity generating company suppliers were going to be squeezed, particularly if they had no other customers. This was exactly British Coal's position. Among those who saw the dangers at the time was the right-wing think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs.
I think the situation was perfectly predictable. In fact, what's happened was very similar to what we pointed out in 1985. If you have a big buyer or two big buyers of coal in the generation industry, because of that, they're going to have an awful lot of market power, and the coal industry is bound to be in trouble in those circumstances. So it was very easy to predict what would happen. But when the government privatised electricity, it seemed, I don't know whether it didn't really care, or it was simply not wanting to anticipate the problems that would arise later. But whatever the reason, they didn't take any action that would have helped the coal industry.
It's all very well for these, pocket admirals sitting in their baths playing with their little battleships, but ignoring such things as electoral mandates and time constraints. But the truth of the matter is, if you're given a job and you have 4 years only in which to do it, there is a strict limitation on what you can do.
Put the valve on outside to see how it goes now.
Music shouted our colours
No, they won't put in a service head.
This was a self-imposed limitation. The government was in control of the speed with which the electricity industry was sold off. It gave a higher priority to its privatisation policy than introducing real competition. Today, even Parkinson admits it was unsatisfactory to leave so much power in so few hands.
In an ideal world, one would have had 5 generators and the nuclear company owned by the 5. The competition was, if you couldn't create it overnight, was bound to take time to develop. We did create far more competition than has been created in any other privatisation, and we created the possibility of a lot more. And it will develop, but it takes time.
If you want to find one issue, one thing that went wrong, that's what went wrong. They probably needed maybe 6 generators or something like this. So there would have been genuine competition in the industry. And that would have meant, when these generators were making decisions as to whether to buy coal or gas or whatever, they would have been looking over their shoulders at their competitors, and they would have not have made decisions if they weren't the lowest cost decisions they could have made.
When the government tackled the problem of the two powerful generating companies, it struck the third blow against coal. Its solution was to give the generators' customers, the 12 regional electricity companies, a special concession. They were allowed to buy up to 15% of their electricity from sources other than the two big generators. And keen to strengthen their hand against their powerful suppliers, it was a freedom they immediately used. The quickest alternative to the generators' coal-fired stations were gas-powered stations. The regional electricity companies, the RECs, started the dash for gas.
You still have two big monopoly generators, National Power and Powergen, and ranged against them are these 12 RECs, who are, under the terms of the privatisation, now allowed to generate some of their own power. So in order to reduce their reliance on these big monopoly suppliers, they, of course, looked very quickly for ways of generating their own power. The quickest way to do that is to build new gas-fired power stations. So that was the way that this dash for gas really began.
The first gas-fired station to come into operation in October 1991 was the Rooskote station in Cumbria. One of the newly created regional electricity companies, Norweb, bought a 20% stake and signed a 15-year agreement to buy all of its output. The appeal of this deal for Norweb is it reduces its reliance on the big generators' coal-fired capacity and gives them a mix of contract lengths.
We believe that our customers want stable prices as well. They don't want to see the price of electricity going all over the place, and so they want consistent prices. So we believe we have to build a portfolio of electricity contracts of both different types of generation, different types of fuel, and different lengths of contract with different indexation, because that's the best way we can get reliability of supplies and stability of prices.
Other electricity companies were quick to follow Rooskote's lead. Gas-powered stations can be built quickly, so it was the easiest way for the regional electricity companies to build up their own generating capacity. Over the next 3 years, new gas-fired stations will add at least 20% to electricity capacity when there is already a surplus. Inevitably, when they come on stream, some coal-fired stations will close down. But the recent gas price rise and the high capital costs of the new stations mean they will produce more expensive electricity than the old coal-fired stations, paid for years ago.
If you look at an old coal-fired station which needs to be replaced and compare the cost of a generation from a new coal-fired station with a new gas station, there's no doubt that gas wins out in price terms. But on the other hand, if you are looking to replace an existing coal-fired station with plenty of economic years left to run, there is no doubt again that the coal station wins out hands down.
Despite this, the regional electricity companies are pressing ahead with gas-fired stations, so they have leverage against the two generating companies. To the regulator, this makes sense.
The decisions about where and when and whether to build power stations are really commercial decisions for the companies involved. They need to take a view about what prices of electricity are now and what they're likely to be in the future, what the amount of capacity is likely to be in the future, whether they think they can produce more efficiently than other people or not. If they can make a profit, then they will find it profitable to invest. If they can't make a profit, they won't. So I think the prime thing should be that the companies themselves have to make a commercial judgment, and they take the risks of loss if they get it wrong.
But regional electricity companies are not subject to normal commercial pressures. The cost of their gas has been fixed for 15 years. This long-term contract is matched by another 15-year contract to supply electricity. Profits are virtually guaranteed.
So for 15 years, we have got people coming into this market who are going to be guaranteed a profit. They have their contracts for electricity supply in place. They have their contracts for gas supply in place. They have their financial arrangements in place. It's the kind of investment that comes around once in a lifetime, and anybody in their right minds would pile into an investment like that. It is bound to make money.
To build these independent power stations clearly needs long-term contracts to finance the projects, and that's why they are long-term contracts. But our portfolio is the key to the whole of this approach, to build that balanced portfolio of different types of contracts for electricity supply.
The regional electricity companies are aiming to buy electricity from a number of suppliers and generated by at least 3 different fuels: nuclear, gas and coal. But many of the gas-fired stations, regarded as independent, are not. Most regional electricity companies have big shareholdings in gas stations, and the danger is that the contract between these allegedly independent stations and the regional electricity companies will not be at arm's length. The high cost of the gas will simply go on the consumer's bill. So far, the regulator has taken a hands-off approach.
It seemed to me right to allow people who are thinking of entering the industry the ability to do so, so that we could discover which of these different ways of generating electricity is really the cheapest. So the job of the regulator is not just to put restrictions on to protect customers, it's also to promote competition, because in the long term, that's the best way of protecting customers.
I fail to see how it can possibly increase competition for people to be able to enter the market on 15-year contracts which are fixed in place, where they're guaranteed to run, guaranteed to produce electricity, guaranteed a price, guaranteed a cost for their gas, and cannot possibly lose money. I fail to see how that, in anybody's definition, can be seen as competition.
The danger of these developments to British coal had been clear for some time, and the government had certainly been warned.
I think on 27 occasions over a period of 14 months, I had publicly warned about the effects of the dash for gas. And obviously privately, and this is much more important in terms of our strategic presentations to government, and indeed the work that the government's own advisors, Rothschilds, had done. The facts were very fully and very clearly presented, so I didn't think there was any doubt, or should be any doubt in anybody's mind as to what was the effect of the dash for gas. It was all too plain.
The effect which Clark feared has now materialised. Consequently, he is forced to close potentially profitable pits because the coal-fired stations will not sign long-term contracts with him. As a genuinely independent supplier, British Coal cannot copy its gas competitors.
They have long-term contracts to take the gas. They have long-term contracts to sell the electricity. That is the basis on which they've been financed. That is why they will push coal out of its place as the baseload fuel for generating electricity. Yes, from that point of view, I think the competition is unfair because those contracts were not available to British Coal.
If there was a free market in electricity, the cheaper coal-fired power stations would be able to beat these new gas stations. But electricity is not a free market. This is the fourth blow against coal. Late in the privatisation process, the government hit another problem. Competition needs a marketplace. As there was no marketplace for electricity, they invented one. It's called the pool. The pool is run from this control room at the headquarters of the National Grid in southeast London. All day long, power stations throughout England and Wales offer electricity to the people in this room. There is nothing like it anywhere else in the world, and it must be the only marketplace with over 750 pages of detailed rules and regulations.
The pool is a very complex arrangement, I think, as you probably understand. Essentially, it's a means of pricing electricity half hour by half hour every day, and to ensure that the cheapest plant supplies with each of those half-hour time slots. That's how it works, and it keeps the overall cost of electricity generated down.
This sounds straightforward, but it's not. 95% of the electricity which passes through the national grid has already been pre-sold at a fixed price to the regional electricity companies. The generators are only bidding into the pool to ensure they can use the grid to get the electricity to their customer. So they bid into the pool at a low price, and the customer sends them a cheque for the difference.
The position now, quite simply, is anybody can bid any price they like. And if they have a contract in place, they don't give a damn what price they bid. They simply bid in order to run.
The effect of the pooling arrangement is that low-cost stations, like the coal-fired stations, cannot make use of this competitive advantage. Major industrial customers who want to buy this electricity can't.
One of the things we most certainly don't have is a marketplace as people would understand it. A market involves a seller and a buyer getting together and negotiating a price for something. In this case, the buyer is notably absent. The sellers appear to determine the price that they want to charge, and they charge it.
Brian Bullock runs ICI's chlorine plant near Runcorn in Cheshire. it consumes as much electricity as the city of Liverpool. All Bullock wants is the right to negotiate a bulk deal with the local coal-fired station across the Mersey.
What makes me really angry is that within a 5-mile radius of this site, we have 2 major power stations generating electricity at little more than half the price that we're having to pay. And does the government really intend to stand by and watch a whole sector of British manufacturing industry go to the wall simply because of a dogmatic adherence to an arbitrary tariff structure?
It seems a crazy system that allows expensive gas-fired stations to be used and not the cheaper coal-fired stations. A system which does not allow ICI to buy direct from its local power station. The regulator now recognises that the pool system may need changing.
I don't want the pool to become a straitjacket on improvements in efficiency and offering better services. So I think we shall have to look at the pool to make sure it works as efficiently as we can and to offer people the alternatives to the pool if that would be more sensible.
One group of people who would not welcome a more sensible arrangement is the electricity industry. For them, privatisation has been a bonanza. The industry's profits have risen by 30% to £2.5 billion in the first year of private ownership. The next blow against coal is the result of the government's attempts to protect British coal from the excesses of the electricity industry's drive to increase profits. British Coal was given a contract to supply coal to the electricity generators, but it was too short. Since the early 1980s, British Coal had been trying to reduce its costs by closing pits and increasing productivity.
The strategy was very simple. We had to start work on trying to improve the efficiency of the mines, and this required a careful analysis of the costs and the factors that entered into the costs, and then to tackle the necessity for these costs being spent. As we found in many cases, there were operations where no matter what you spent, you couldn't produce a product at a cost which made any sense.
The miners' strike of 1984 was caused by British Coal's determination to put this plan into action.
Where they perform, they've got a future. Where they don't perform, they've got no future.
With the miners defeated, British Coal had a free hand.
When our people came back to work under their own volition, they pretty well indicated that they were prepared to subscribe to the general idea of making the industry more efficient. We started incentive schemes in the mines, which of course had been taboo up to that time. They ran totally counter to Mr. Scoggle's ideas. And with these bonus schemes, the boys went to work with a will, and we got very, very sharp improvement in performance.
The amount of coal produced by each miner rose dramatically. By 1992, the number of miners in British pits was just 1/3 of the level 7 years before, but in total, they produced the same amount of coal. The price of coal fell accordingly. But at the time of electricity privatisation, British Coal believed that more could be achieved. So to help the coal industry, the government insisted for the 3 years up to April 1993 that the electricity generating companies buy the bulk of their coal in Britain.
I myself would have preferred to see the initial contracts being longer than 3 years. But that was a decision that was taken in the light of all the then facts after I'd left. But I'd always had in mind myself rather longer initial contracts so that people could get used to the idea that they had a freedom of choice. If you give people a freedom for the first time, they're bound to want to exercise it. If they've had it for a certain time, they might exercise it a little more sparingly.
At the time of privatisation, the government put in place 3-year transitional contracts to smooth the path. And under those contracts, we sold electricity to the regional electricity companies, and we backed that by purchasing coal from British Coal. The government brokered those arrangements, and effectively it meant that Powergen and ourselves have been burning about 65 million tonnes a year of British coal, despite the fact that over that period it was about 50% more expensive than imported fuels we could have gone out and bought but for these contracts.
Britain's coal imports have risen dramatically in recent years as ships have come in daily to places like Thamesport. But it is highly unlikely that Britain's electricity generating companies could ever have bought 60 million tonnes a year. Such purchases would represent a sixth of total world exports and would almost certainly push up the price. However, the low price of imported coal is being used as a bargaining counter by the electricity generators to push down the price they're willing to offer for British coal, despite the enormous productivity improvements made in the mining industry during the 80s.
To put it more in context, against the new contracts that we will sign with the generators, we're going to have to achieve something like that all over again in the next 5 years to make us then competitive in world terms against imported coal. Imported coal, which is often sold on a marginal basis, I don't use the word dumped, but it is sold on a marginal basis, supported by long-term base contracts with big customers.
Those campaigning to keep the pits open march through Liverpool. The threat of cheap imports is one of their rallying cries. The coal industry's complaint is that imports are being sold below the total cost of production. That is excluding the costs of the large amount of capital investment in the mines.
When they tell me that it's right that Britain's coal industry should compete with children at 5 in Colombia, that's not economic fairness or sense in political or social terms.
The reason why the international market is able to supply into Britain coal at what appears to be a cheaper price is because it's heavily subsidised or dumped.
1.5 million tonnes of imported coal is unloaded at Liverpool docks every year. No one knows exactly how much imported coal is dumped, but British Coal has lodged a complaint with the European Commission. But in the meantime, imported prices are a guideline. Even the electricity generators believe that British coal can meet them.
In a few years' time, 3, 4, 5 years' time, British coal will by then be capable of selling, let's say, 40 million tonnes of its output at world competitive prices. The problem is, how do they get to that? And because it would obviously be valuable to us to have a large British supplier of coal at world competitive prices, we're certainly prepared with further transitional arrangements.
British Coal's customers, like National Power, are keen on UK coal at the right price because there are risks in relying on imports. Changes in exchange rates can suddenly increase price, and the supply cannot always be relied upon. But the generating companies need to get agreement with their customers, the regional electricity companies, to buy the electricity made from British coal.
I think the strategic benefit of having a coal industry is something which we've taken into account. And certainly in our recent discussions with the generators, we have looked at longer-term contracts which would secure the base for a viable coal industry. I think perhaps the argument is about what size that should be and clearly at what price it should be offering coal at.
We have offered to cut our prices by no less than 20% in the first year and increasingly cut them over the remaining term of the contract.
Despite 9 months of complex negotiations, Clark has not managed to sign a deal with the electricity generating companies. Clearly, they must be hoping that the nearer the April deadline gets, the lower British coal will drop its price. This is where the government could take a role, by helping to extend an agreement which they themselves put in place at the time of electricity privatisation. Elsewhere in Europe, governments habitually intervene in the energy market. In Germany, as in Britain, the number of people employed in the coal industry has fallen sharply over the last decade, as production has been concentrated on a small number of large pits. Ruhr Coal is Germany's largest coal combine, producing just over 50 million tonnes of coal a year and employing 88,000 miners. Unlike England, it is part of a company which includes its customers, power stations and smokeless fuel plants. Unlike England, it is in the private sector. And unlike England, there is a political and social consensus to support the most efficient mining possible by long-term contracts and subsidy.
there is a national energy policy and a national agreement, and this, let me say, agreement, political agreement, is the basis why the German government pay subsidies to German coal industry.
They have a different philosophy, yes. They regard it as important to have contractual arrangements and subsidy arrangements to preserve, for security reasons, a long-run natural resource. There is a completely different approach to the philosophy that is applied.
The government in this country has made a long-term energy plan after the oil crisis of the 70s. And the national aim was to replace imported oil, which suddenly became very expensive, to replace it in power plants by both indigenous coal and nuclear energy.
Their coal industry produces at £110 a tonne, compared with about £38 per tonne here in Britain. And yet the German government gives a massive state subsidy of £2.5 billion a year under the same European directive that allows Britain to give to this nuclear industry £1.3 billion subsidy each year. If the British coal industry received the same subsidy, we could give our coal away free, we could give them a £10 voucher with every tonne of coal we sold, and still declare a profit at the end of the year.
The British government would prefer the private sector to find a solution, and several private companies in the coal industry have expressed an interest. But they have some important conditions, all aimed at reducing competition. One of the companies interested is a big customer of British coal, Anglo United, makers of the smokeless fuel Coalite. They're concerned by the threat posed by the old Magnox nuclear stations, the gas stations, and new environmental controls.
We'd love to buy it, provided it's in some form that is the right size, that it's an industry which has got a future. The interruption of certain of the gas contracts, the early closure of the Magnox power stations, the introduction of, by government, with government effort, of clean coal technology to enable us to have much more coal-generating power stations in the future.
Macalane's terms also include plans to close at least 20 pits. Other private sector bidders, like the owner of this open cast mine, have similar conditions. British Coal's historical liabilities, like the cost of meeting subsidence and any environmental claims, are not part of the package that Richard Budge wants to buy.
We've been offering to take over British Coal pits for some years.
If you were going to take British Coal off the government's hands, are there any particular clauses which you would demand?
Yes, that the historical liabilities and costs should remain with the Coal Authority, and the future operations should put something into that fund for their future operations.
In other words, the private sector is not offering the government a cheap solution, nor is it offering anything that British Coal is not already on course to deliver. All British Coal is asking for is an extension of the transitional arrangements put in place 3 years ago. Such a deal would inevitably mean that nuclear or gas-generated electricity would lose out, and the government would have re-entered the management of the energy market.
We cannot arrange the market ourselves. It has to be arranged by others taking steps either to reduce the dash for gas, to reduce the prior tranche that nuclear power has, to reduce imported coals, and to reduce the very rapid rundown of the generators' stocks.
Cheap energy is what the whole of Western capitalist world is based on. And it is actually so crucially and fundamentally a part of the economy that it is impossible for there not to be political intervention.
This is just the government's dilemma. For 13 years, it has progressively pulled back from intervening in business. But the particular features of the power industry have shown the social and economic difficulties in doing this. So there is clearly more at stake in its current political embarrassment than simply closing 30 pits. The odds are that in 50 days, the government will, not for the first time, rig the energy market. but on this occasion tipping the balance towards coal.
Crucial Edinburgh summit draws near. Dispatches next week examines Britain's controversial presidency of the EC. Throughout the 6-month tenure, the programme has gained